All right, Wade, you can start in 5.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Explorers Club Earth Day special, if you will. My name is WadeDavis. I've been a fellow an honorary member of the club for many years, and it's a joy to be with you, and especially a joy to be with a wonderful writer, Tony Hiss, who's just brought out an important book, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth, with an introduction by the legendary biologist E.O. Wilson. And I think that we couldn't have a better guest or a better topic on this important day, Earth Day, than Tony. He's the author of 15 books, including the bestseller, The Experience of Place, that Terry Tempest Williams, a good friend of mine, particularly loves. Tony was a staff writer at the New Yorker for 30 years, and he's brought us a book that is full of optimism, full of hope. He clearly comes from the school of thinking in which pessimism is seen as indulgence, orthodoxy the enemy of invention, despair and insult to the imagination. And so what we're going to do tonight is ask and invite Tony to speak for 10, 15 minutes, as long as he would like, and then we'll have a nice conversation. And then as we get toward the end of the hour, we'll open it up to the chat for your questions. By all means, put your questions into the chat, and we'll be editing them and trying to find the ones that we think will appeal for the most percentage of the audience. But before we launch into Tony's remarks, let me remind you that on Monday, the 26th of April, on the regular Monday night lectures that begin at 7 p.m. East Coast time, the club is incredibly lucky to have a very good friend of mine, Bill Hasseltine, one of the great medical figures of America. But those of you who have been fortunate enough to be on Bill's email chain since the very beginning of COVID, or have seen him on CNN and any number of other broadcasts, will know that Bill has been almost a saint-like guide to all of us over all issues of COVID, including the publication of guidebooks for families, for children, for school teachers. He's done an incredible job, and we all are in his debt, and very grateful that Ann Passer was able to invite him to speak on the 26th, April 26th, Monday at 7 p.m. So with that, let me pass over to Tony and congratulate him on this really, truly wonderful new book that I encourage all of you to buy and gift to your children. Tony?
Thank you, Wade. It is such an honor for any author to be at the Explorers Club. And to me, it's a great honor in addition to be in the company of such a distinguished and passionate author as Wade. Really looking forward to this conversation. And the fact that it's taking place on Earth Day is, to me, even more important. The Explorers Club is the home of bold people, the first people to go to the bottom of the ocean, the first people to go to the top of Mount Everest. These are the Explorers Club members. And to have a chance to speak before such an audience is, to me, one of the highlights of my career. So I would like to show you a few pictures, as Wade was suggesting. Are we on screen?
Yep, you're all good.
Earth Day is the perfect day to think big thoughts. And this book is about a big thought, namely that we can stave off a mass extinctions crisis by protecting half the land and water in the world. Half Earth to keep life alive. The biodiversity emergency and crisis is sometimes thought of as that other crisis, in addition to climate change, but they're, of course, closely intertwined. The great calamity that we face is that something like 1 million species are at risk of extinction over the next few decades. This, for instance, was the last male northern white rhino, died a couple of years ago in Kenya after his beloved keeper had come in for one last scratch behind the ears. This is Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who was 101 when he died a few years ago. These passings have given us, unfortunately, a word we hoped we'd never have to coin, an Endling. An Endling is the last of its species. I think one of the reasons we got into trouble was that we thought when we did something new, that was all we could think about, and we couldn't think of doing more than one thing at a time. This painting, which was famous in the 1870s, was called American Progress. Progress being that golden-haired young lady with not very many clothes on, who is floating from east to west across the continent, trailing telegraph wires behind her, and accompanied by stagecoach, covered wagon, and trains. Now, I happen to love train rides, but I don't think that train rides necessarily have to come at the expense of, in this case, the Native American population, the bison, and the snarling bear in the lower left-hand corner. Fortunately, quite a long time ago, some people began to think beyond lost to larger areas. One of the first was a craggy forester from New England named Benton Mackay, who, the year he graduated from college in 1900, bushwhacked his way up Stratton Mountain in Vermont, shinnied up the tallest tree he could find, and swaying there, looked out across the landscape, and suddenly, as he later said, he was overcome by what he called a planetary feeling, the idea that he was in the midst of a single place that stretched the length of the Appalachian Mountains from Maine all the way down to Georgia, and that, as he then later wrote, it would be possible to create and connect all of these mountain peaks along a footpath, which became the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail, 2,190 miles long, connects the peaks across 14 states, but Mackay was always concerned with the landscape on either side of the peaks, something he called the Appalachian Realm. Beautiful end paper map that was created for my book shows the 4 largest landscapes of North America. And the one on the right, from top to bottom, the Appalachian Realm, is actually the smallest of the 4. We're lucky in North America that we have sort of great bones, a geography that lets us begin to have in our minds a picture of where we are. Got the Appalachians running down the east, but paralleled by the Rockies running down in the west. And a brilliant Canadian activist and visionary, Harvey Locke, in the 1990s had his own vision in the Rockies that was similar to Mackay's vision. Harvey saw in his mind a single landscape stretching north from Yellowstone National Park, the very first national park anywhere in the world, from 1870 all the way up to the top of the Yukon. He called it Yellowstone to Yukon, or Y to Y. And since then, it's become the nucleus for an extraordinary effort to protect that landscape, now 21% protected. And beyond that, people see it as embedded within an even larger mountain chain running from Mexico all the way up to Alaska. Then across the top of the continent is Canada's great treasure, the world's great treasure, the Boreal Forest, probably the most intact and largest wildness left in the world. Almost impossible, even having been there, for a city boy like me to stretch his mind around it. It's 3,700 miles long. It's 1,000 miles from top to bottom. It's 85% intact. Just an amazingness in this day and age. Then down at the bottom of the US states is the most recently identified large landscape, the North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. It's a good thing people began thinking big so many years ago because our traditional way of just isolating wild places and thinking that would solve problems was running into trouble years and years ago, when it was shown that the national parks were leaking species. Animals were not staying put, they would leave, and once development surrounded the parks, they couldn't get back inside. So all that's led over the years to this idea of half Earth. Why half Earth? It's the question I get asked probably more often than any other. Well, partly because some brilliant field studies have showed that most animals need at least 50% of their original habitat in order to thrive. There's some variation in that. Also because E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist and biodiversity champion, has been able to do some predictive math showing that if we stay at 15%, which is pretty much the continental and world figure of protected land now, we're likely to retain only a quarter or even less of all the plants and animals. However, if we bump that up to 50%, we have a chance to retain at least 85 to 90%. That's not everything, but it's close to everything. And it's a lot better than 25% or less. I'd like you to look for one moment into the eyes of this passionate Russian biologist, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, who in the 1920s wrote the first definitive book about the biosphere, that layer of life that contains all of us and everything else. He was able to make it plain that this is an incredibly ancient something. It's at least 3.8 billion years old, this layer of life. It's incredibly big, seen from side to side, the kind of side-to-sideness that has allowed the explorers we cherish and celebrate to lead the way for us. But by its very nature, it's also quite precarious. Namely, it has a third dimension, its height, or rather its lack of, its thinness. Almost all of life exists between the bottom of the ocean and the top of Mount Everest, a distance of only 12.5 miles. Laid out horizontally, that is a distance you could drive in 20 minutes. You could drive from one end of life to the other in 20 minutes. So here we are in this situation where we're exploring, we continue to explore and finding amazing things around the globe. Like this spider that some Indian scientists found just a few years ago and thought was so adorable, they deliberately gave it the scientific name Areovixia gryffindori because to them it looked like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. And they thought maybe people would feel a little more kinship with spiders through the medium of Harry Potter. The vulture on the right is an African vulture that can fly so high it once collided with a jet airliner. But within this context of something that's ancient, enormous, and yet so gossamer thin, we're presented back at the half-Earth blackboard with what I call the 3 R's. To protect biodiversity, we have to retain what is still wild, places like the boreal forest. We have to restore places that were once wilder, and we have to reconnect places that have been severed. The boreal again. This is a wonderful place for showing how intertwined climate change and biodiversity protection are. It's a place that has 2 nicknames. It's called North America's Bird Nursery because every year 3 billion or more songbirds and shorebirds fly up there to make the next generation. But its second nickname is the Fort Knox of carbon. That's because if all those trees were felled in one swoop and the carbon released from them and from the soil they're growing in and from the peat they're growing in, it would be the equivalent of something like 37 years worth of fossil fuel emissions all at once. let me just go back to that for 1 second, because the great news out of Canada is that this intactness of this wildness can now be retained in a way that hadn't been thought of before. Canada has its own gorgeous system of national parks, but the challenge is to protect something far bigger. And they're now turning to their own Indigenous population, First Nations as they're called in Canada, and asking them, people who have been living on that land for 10,000 years or more and knowing all about it, to become the rangers of a whole new kind of park system called Indigenous Protected Areas, or IPAs, or as some of the First Nations people are saying, mucklucks on the ground. Here is a chance to enlist their aid and do something that the world has never seen before, or at least only one other place in the world has seen before, and that's Australia, where some of the Aboriginal groups have also been taking over management of vast stretches of territory. So that's a new idea. But we're also being challenged to resurrect some ideas that almost got started and never quite did. In addition to national parks as we know them, Americans invented the idea of the Green Line Park, which is a special place that is not necessarily in public ownership. The Adirondack Park up at the top of New York State is the world's first Green Line Park. It's 6 million acres, but only half of it is publicly owned. The rest is in private ownership. But the concept is that by recognizing it as a special place, all of the landowners, private and public, agree that it will change in a way that respects that specialness, only change in that way. In the 1970s, US National Park Service people thought it was time to bring this idea back home, because we'd sort of lost it to the English. After World War II, the English decided it was time for them to create a national park system to make the place a land fit for their returning heroes. And they turned to the Green Line Park concept. Special places in England like the Lake District, so beloved by William Wordsworth, and they've now protected something like 30% of England in Green Line National Parks and a second tier called the Areas of Outstanding National Beauty. Well, this was going to be the great environmental second park system legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration, but there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration, President Carter having been beaten by Ronald Reagan in 1980. Now the idea is coming back to the front, and in the eastern shore of Maryland, the so-called Delmarva Peninsula, it's carved up between 3 states, Delaware, Del, Maryland, Mar, Virginia, Va, awkward name. They are decided they will make that place not a Green Line Park, which they're calling an outstanding area, or Oasis, OA, and protect at least half of that landscape by 2030. Should just pause to mention that one of the reasons we have so much more extensive an idea of what we need to do is that the animals are finally helping us out, or we're letting the animals help us out. In the 1990s, a wolf named Pluie was caught near Banff National Park in Canada, fitted with one of the first tracking devices that a satellite could pick up and let loose. And it was expected maybe she would wander 50, 60 miles. Wolves wandered, we knew that much. But her collar went dead, or we thought it did, after a few months. And well, that's science. And except that several months after that, some NASA people called up the researchers in Canada who had named the wolf Pluie because she'd been caught in a drenching rainstorm, and said, we just picked up your wolf on our screens, and she's way away from where you are. She's down here in the States. Well, it turned out that over the next 18 months, Pluie traversed an area across 3 US states and 2 Canadian provinces, an area 10 times the size of Yellowstone. So Pluie in some ways is the co-founder of Yellowstone to Yukon, of Y2Y. And now that we're able to do miniaturize tracking devices so much more, A brilliant West German scientist, Martin Wikelski, has come up with the notion of the animal internet. They've now put some antenna on the International Space Station. It's going to be able to pick up the signal of 300,000 animals at once and let them tell us where they are and what their needs are. Among birders, there's the phrase spark bird, and that refers to that bird that first caught their eye, first grabbed their attention and wouldn't let go sometime in their life and became a permanent part of their existence and gave them a permanent connection to nature. Well, it doesn't have to be a bird. It could be a wildflower, it could be a view, it could be the sight of the Hudson River for a New York guy like myself, or it could be swinging from the top of a tree like Benton Mackay, something that induces a planetary feeling that never goes away. Such a pleasure to be with you, and do want to say that for anyone who wants to buy a copy of the book, the social distancing way of handling book signings these days is that I can sign book plates, which people can put into the books. And if you really are interested in having one that's personally inscribed, let me know and I will do that and mail it off to you. Wade, let's turn it back to you, and thank you so much for looking at these pictures.
Well, thank you, Tony. It was a wonderful presentation and so many questions. I love that image of the 12.5 miles. It reminds me of once I was on Everest and this climber said to me, the most amazing thing about climbing Everest is the realization there's a place where you can strap on your boots and by your own motor skills walk in a day to a place where oxygen deprivation itself obliterates consciousness. And he said, if that doesn't remind us of how thin this veil of life is, nothing will. And as you were, those images from space reminded me of the first public talk I ever did professionally. I was between Richard Leakey, who with his mom and dad had drawn from the dust and ashes of Africa, the story of our birth of our species. And on the other side of me was Story Musgrave, the first physician to walk in space. And it was an odd and moving juxtaposition of the endpoints of the human experience. And the irony wasn't lost on Story. And then he said what it had been like to be in space, 200 miles above the surface of the planet, 18,000 kilometers an hour, the golden visor of his helmet illuminated by that single sight, that blue planet floating, as they said, in the velvet void of space. And he said to me that to have experienced that sight, a sight only made possible by the brilliance of the human imagination, of science, of technology, and then to remember the callous way in which we treat our only home was the pure sensation of horror. And I think, this is the theme of Earth Day. Why is it that we do what we do? I mean, think, Tony, we spend billions of dollars to send probes into space, to look for water on Mars and ice on the moons of Jupiter, even as we spend equal sums of money on misguided industrial schemes that destroy the little bit of water that we have on the planet. As you well know, if we took all of the fresh water accessible to us and put it into a gallon jug, all the water on the planet, a blue planet, into a gallon jug, what is actually accessible for us to drink would fill a teaspoon. And yet we live in this kind of series of contradictions, which I think lie at the heart of our relationship. I once was in the Sahara, and a truck smuggler in Mauritania said to me about dying of thirst. He said, in the desert, the great thing about brake fluid is it keeps you off the battery acid. That's how precious water is. And yet, why do we squander it, Tony?
So many good questions there. Earth Day was really, in some ways, preceded by the fact that we finally were getting out beyond the Earth. The iconic photograph Earthrise, showing the Earth rising above the surface of the moon, was snapped in 1968 by Apollo astronauts. And the first Earth Day came 2 years later. A number of people who've had the wonderful opportunity to get up into space have looked back, like the doctor you were mentioning, and seen the wonderfulness and vulnerability of the planet all at once for the first time. And it's actually been given a name, the overview effect. I think what's seeping into us now is that same realization of amazingness and vulnerability down here below, more of an interview effect.
Yeah, I remember, Tony, I was once in the forest of Borneo with a friend of mine, and by a fire, and the moon shone through the canopy of the forest, and he asked me, he was a nomadic Panan whose possessions just could be carried on his back. And he asked me if it was true my people had been there. And I said, yes. How did they get there? Why'd they go? And is it true they just brought back rock and dust? And it was hard to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint, a space program that had done all of that and come back with just rock and dust, 728 pounds. But that's what you're really saying. We didn't go into space for new wealth. We went to acquire a new vision of life itself. Now, curiously, when I left Barbados on that original trip, I went to two places I bet you know that in a more sensitive world might be memorialized for the ecological tragedies. The first was a bit of woodland on the banks of the Green River, which was the site of the last nesting flock of passenger pigeons. And, you know, pigeons made up 40% of birds in North America. Audubon described flocks obliterating the sun over Cincinnati, 2 and 3 billion birds that would turn a summer landscape into a winter landscape with the sheer accumulation of guano. And from the height of those populations to their extinction was really just about a generation. Pigeon meat was a mainstay of the American diet. Our term, by the way, stool pigeon, derives from a hunting technique of the era. You would capture a pigeon, sew its eyelids shut, tie its feet to a pole, put the pole into the ground, and its cry would bring in the flocks in such abundance they could be just batted out of the sky. And right from there, I went to Sioux City, Iowa to give a talk, and a young botanist in a winter landscape was taking me through a field of tired herbs. And I tried to imagine the physics of waves as buffalo moved through that tall grass prairie that once was there. And again, in the lifetime of my great-grandfather, buffalo outnumbered people in North America. Individual herds had grazing areas the size of the state of Rhode Island. And from the height of their population to their reduction to a zoological curiosity was 8 years as explicit policy of the US cavalry to destroy the commissary of the Great Plains people. And when Sherman's campaign succeeded, he recommended to the US Congress that a commemorative medal be minted with, on one side, a dead buffalo, on the other side, a dead Indian. And what was most disturbing to me was to know that the good people of Iowa, as decent as any American can be, today live in a world that is positively claustrophobic in its monotony, cornfields to the horizon. And for them, the time of the buffalo is as distant to their lives, as irrelevant to their lives as the fall of Rome. And yet again, it happened. So this thing that scientists call shifting baseline syndrome, our ability to adapt to any degree of environmental change or degradation, seems to me a haunting trait of our species, this sort of fluidity of memory, our capacity to forget how bountiful the earth once was. Can you comment on that?
Well, Wade, I think you're suggesting that there's a diminution of attention and possibility with each new depredation. But I think there's something that reaches beyond that. One of the people I was privileged to meet while working on my book was a pal of E.O. Wilson's, a guy down in the panhandle of Florida.
I love that guy. I mean,
Davis.
The guy who was just going by the school and he heard these
Yeah.
two women. Yeah, it's a great story.
Well,
Sorry, interrupt.
Here's someone who was a self-made millionaire. He liked to always called himself a dirt road panhandle guy. He actually got started in life the only way to make some money was playing poker professionally. But he took that stake and became a multimillionaire commodities trader. One day he was stuck in a traffic jam in Florida, furious and frantic. And he looked out of the windshield and there was this sign on a high school billboard, Black Bear Seminar. And he thought anything is better than this. He peeled off went into the auditorium, and he said there were a couple of drunks sleeping it off, and 3 or 4, he said Canadians, I shouldn't cast no aspersions, looking, he thought, for day-old donuts. And up on the stage were 2 extraordinary women who were talking about the plight of the Florida black bear, a subspecies of black bear. And he was entranced. This was his Sparkbird moment. And he sat there, and the next day sent them a check so they could carry on their work for 2 more years. And they were taken aback. Never had a donation like this before. And they said, "What do you want?" He said, "Well, what I want is for you to draw up a list for me of the 100 most important environmental books, because I am behind and I need to get up to speed." So he spent a year reading those books. And then he said, "Now I know what to do. I can restore the landscape that was the home to these black bears. The great forest of the Southeast, the longleaf pine forest, which had been largely chopped down after the Civil War in this country, as a new source of income for bankrupt plantation owners, is probably the reason why Scarlett O'Hara said, 'I will never go hungry again.' But there was not many trees left. He bought up 51,000 acres of played out peanut farms and began planting 500,000 seedlings a year of longleaf pine. By the time I got to see him, it was 12 or 13 years later, the place still looked pretty scruffy. And he said, 'Well, but that's because we're in year 13 of a 300-year project.' He unfortunately died a few years later, but not before endowing the Nogosi plantation, as it was called, with enough money to keep it going for the next 280 years or more.
Well, that's Tony. I mean, that really is the spirit of your book, isn't it? I mean, you reveal to us this army of people, men and women, some known like Ted Turner, others unknown, but all over the place, not just today, but through the past, who have been sort of working on their own personal visions of conservation. And this,
right.
This wonderful sense of, Ed Wilson once said that, every great scientist began as a bug collector. And a friend of mine, a great environmentalist in Canada, said, I asked, what do we do to get people to love nature? He says, get them out in it. In other words, there's something about turning people on. I love this idea of your spark moment, be it a bird or a moment or whatever. If we don't get people engaged in the wonder of nature, we can't expect them to want to protect it. And one of the things I find strange is that you can go through university, for example, you can't graduate if you don't know the difference between a poem and a work of prose, or between a painting and a photograph, but you can go through without knowing the formula of life, photosynthesis, right? And I came very close to missing out on biology until I happened to go to the Amazon and become enchanted. And so this idea of, and that's why Ed Wilson has been so incredible. I mean, his books have done more to turn people on to the wonder of nature than any 1,000 dry-mouthed academics. And so again, this idea of through narrative and storytelling, and there is such reason for hope. I mean, 40 years ago, just getting people to stop throwing a garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. No one spoke of the biosphere. Now it's part of the language of school children. And we can look around the world. I love all the stories in the book. Tell us some more stories like Pluie. I mean, there are these wonderful stories of, the hidden wonder of nature, the wonder of migrations, the chemical communication between the mycelia networks of a forest, the miracle that is nature itself. And that's, incredible part of the book.
I'll first go back to the point you were making a second ago, which is getting people sparked. There's a wonderful naturalist here in New York named Timon McPherson. And I took a walk around Greenwich Village. I live in Greenwich Village in Manhattan with him one day. We walked outside my building and he said, "Look around you, rejoice, you're in an ecosystem." I said, "What? I see sidewalk." He said, "Well, look more closely at the sidewalk." And there, growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, are tiny little plants. Can't get rid of them. There they are. They just keep springing back. And then there are ants crawling across the sidewalk. Ants, the creature that Ed Wilson loves better than anything else.
Well, you also write in the book, Tony, that New York City has 7,000 acres of woodland.
And there you got it. 7,000 very good acres of woodland in natural condition. And it turns out the 50 largest cities in the US got together, parks people from those cities, and realized that among them, there was something like 750,000, no, even more than that, acres of natural land within these city limits, something close to the size of Yellowstone National Park, if you put it all together.
Well, you know, Stuart Brand in one of his books is very hopeful in saying that as we've in fact become an urban-based species, only in recent years, the majority of human beings actually living in, that's also meant we've abandoned worked over lands, all of which can be restored, as the story of Florida tells us.
Well, yes, and as to that, suburbs equally can be restored. It's been estimated that if people devoted even half of their lawns, which tend to be monocultures, just grass, to growing some plants that butterflies love and birds love, that would restore something like 20 million acres of natural land across the country. You mentioned migrations like pluvies. The same thing happened in the study of prey animals, not just the predator animals. Paul Sawyer was trying to track some mule deer only a dozen years ago or so, or even less, got them collared, 40 mule deer in Wyoming, and they too just seemed to disappear. Well, it was because they weren't traveling just a few miles, they were traveling 150 miles. And that gave rise to this whole idea. They wintered down in Wyoming where the snow cover wasn't so deep that they could still forage, but they summered up in the high Tetons where the grass was lush. Had been making this trek twice a year for maybe 6,000 years, and no one had ever noticed, right under our very noses.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that we've learned during COVID, isn't it, that the resilience of nature, it kind of got overlooked after the first flurry of it. But as the global economy shut down, the earth rebounded. You remember there were, you know, not just the canals of Venice being clear, but, you know, rivers turning into brook streams in cities like Medellin, Colombia, wild boar in the streets of Barcelona, caiman blackening the beaches of Baja. We, you know, the skies clearing over Kathmandu, for gosh sakes. And we saw how unbelievably kind of resilient the earth is. And I'm always, whenever I talk to a New Yorker like yourself, I always remember Bobby Kennedy's and the fishermen and the extraordinary transformation of the Hudson.
Well, the Hudson is one of the great early Earth Day success stories. And now, this is one of the great wildernesses of the world, the Hudson River, right outside our front door. And whales have returned.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard someone from Manhattan saw a humpback whale at the mouth of the Hudson.
Well, yes, right within striking distance of the Statue of Liberty.
And yet we have to remember that until that campaign began, you could go up the river to Tarrytown and know what kind of car GM was making by the color of the river, right? It was pretty bad. But the River Thames was even worse in London. In 1957, the Natural History Museum in London declared it biologically dead. There was not even any oxygen left in the river. Well, today there are 125 species of fish, dolphins swimming beneath the bridges of London. So, you know, the earth has such resilience. And I think it's humbling to remember one thing that I think I might have learned from Ed Wilson is that if you took the entire hominid lineage, I mean, going back not just to our predecessor, Homo erectus, all the way back to Homo afarensis, and took that whole chronology and put it on a 24-hour clock of the earth, our presence on the earth would be not 1 second. So in other words, we are ephemeral, but we can do great damage, but we can also restore the planet, which is what your book is really all about. It's so profoundly hopeful, Tony. And the one question I would have, two themes really jumped out. the recognition that indigenous people can become the stewards. You know, the national park idea began in part this idea of wilderness without people. And people like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt weren't particularly charitable to indigenous people. But as a national park model got taken overseas, there were no places without people any more than there had been in Turtle Island. But there are new models for parks. I mean, a friend of mine, Dan Taylor, created the QNP, the bilateral park around the base of Everest. And the whole idea was that the people within the park would become the best stewards of the park, which again is what you discovered with the Dene in northern Canada. And this is a real possibility. Most of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity remains titularly under the control of indigenous people. I find
that is one of the great hopes. They're there, the land is there, and as you say, the land is trying to be as resilient as possible and to be our partner in this effort. I found the boreal is so enormous that in order even to begin to understand it, I had to start creating new concepts, just as astronomers talk about an astronomical unit as the distance between Earth and the sun. 1 AU is a lot easier to remember than 93 million miles. We began thinking, well, the sort of minimum size needed for a protected landscape would be a Yellowstone, a 1Y. But the next jump up would be sort of a California-sized landscape. California is 200 million acres. Yellowstone is roughly 2 million acres. So 50 Ys equal 1 cal, where there is the opportunity for dozens of cals within the boreal forest, all of which could become led by indigenous rangers.
Well, you know, I always say to Americans, if you want to understand how vast this is, you know, turn the continental United States on its side, plop it into Canada, and you'll still have 1,500 kilometers running to the north. I mean, I live in the boreal forest. I own a fishing lodge, and it's a kind of place. It's a kind of place you could throw England, and the English would never find it. You know, the farthest you can get away from a maintained road in the continental United States is 20 miles. In the northwest quadrant of British Columbia, an area of land the size of Oregon, there's one road. So you know,
there are parts of the boreal where there are no roads, whatever. It's beyond
most of the boreal. Yeah.
Places you can only reach on little puddle jumper airplanes.
And you know, one of the things about the indigenous presence, I think it's important for us to remember climate change has become humanity's problem, but humanity didn't cause climate change. It was caused by a narrow subset of humanity that for 300 years has been consuming the ancient sunlight of the world. And one of the things that we see that's very poignant is that indigenous people are often suffering the consequences of climate change for which they have no responsibility.
This is true. This is true.
Whether that's the Inuit in the high Arctic, the people.
But I think we're beginning to move beyond that. The half-Earth notion has been sort of half swallowed now that the Biden administration here in the States is talking about 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the US by the year 2030 as at least a first step and an interim step towards 50 by 50. 56 other countries have already signed on to that notion. And in October in China, 196 nations will adopt 30 by 30 as a global goal. So we're beginning to think at the scale we need to think of.
Have you ever thought, Tony?
Can only happen if the indigenous populations are invited to become part of that.
Have you thought, Tony? I mean, one thing that jumped out of me from your wonderful book is it's global in perspective, but it's focused on the United States largely. It would be fascinating to do a follow-up book that.
Well, yes, thank you.
Where you looked at the world, you know, what's going on.
Thank you. You're inspiring me. But it seemed important to me to start here in North America, your country and my country in Mexico, because we did invent the national park. We can take credit for that. We are inventing with the Australians this new concept of indigenous-led national parks, we did invent the Green Line Park, and we're beginning to return to that. As there are so many strategies that are bubbling up now that's one of the reasons to give me hope. You talked about oxygen returning to the Thames River, but there's also the oxygen that we need to maintain this hope and enthusiasm. It was Benton Mackay who said, optimism, oxygen is optimism. I think everything we hear about that's happening, that's working, gives us hope to take on the next project and
Well,
make it happen too.
And I think, Tony, we shouldn't create a dichotomy between between North America and the rest of the world, as I may have done, because in fact, wonderful things are happening everywhere.
Yes.
For example, a friend of mine, Martin von Hildebrand, who in 1985, the president of Colombia, said to Martin, as head of Indian Affairs, do something for the indigenous people. And in 5 incredible years, he did more than something. He created a series of protected areas owned by the indigenous people, collectively the size of the United Kingdom, in the Northwest Amazon. And that was included in the constitution of the country. Now Martin's vision is something called the Path of the Anaconda.
Ah, yes.
And it's very much like what you show in your maps. If you look at the Amazon today, after 50 years of conservation efforts by all nations, you actually have a lot of protected areas, either national parks, indigenous areas, and to fill in the gaps, as you've discussed, from all the way from the Andes across the entire northern side of the Amazon River, all the way to the Atlantic, does not actually involve the acquisition of that much more protected area.
That's right.
And so this is a vision that is grand in scale, but is eminently doable politically.
Well, wait, you are the great poet of Colombia, and your wonderful book, Magdalena, is only one of the things you've written that inspire us so.
Tony, I didn't pay you to do that. I honestly didn't pay you to
of course not. It's my pleasure and honor.
Very generous of you.
But in terms of people thinking at that kind of scale, there was a plan announced just the other day for ocean protection that would, in the next 5 years, protect as much ocean as would be occupied by South America if it were a land mass and not an ocean mass. So we're finally beginning to think at the right scale. But the other thing that inspires me is that anyone can get involved. Little efforts are just as important because it's only going to happen together. And if people do get sparked, no matter what your interest is, whether you like to hike or you like birds, or there's something happening, and you can Google it in your own neighborhood.
That's Tony, that's a great strength of your book. I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is what I loved about your book. All these characters. I mean, Valeria Clark, what you call her, the water gentler. You should tell us about what she's done.
Again,
but Lucy Braun in the oak forest. I mean, you spoke about the Adirondack Park, but I mean, it's pretty amazing that you have 1 million acres of protected area in one of the most industrialized states of the Union.
Oh, the Long Island, the New Jersey pine barrens. Yes, there's again is an extraordinary story. That was championed by the great writer John McPhee. But interestingly, when McPhee wrote about the pine barrens back in the 60s, the assumption still was the only way to write about a place you had discovered that was fantastic and beloved was to write its obituary.
Yeah.
The book, his brilliant book, has a mournful tone saying,
yeah,
it's not going to be there much longer. It could be saved, but who knows what will happen? And then it did get saved.
Well, there's a very parallel thing apropos to your work with the Dene, is anthropologists always did the same thing. I mean, it was always disappearing worlds. We have to preserve cultures and they're dying. Well, yes, languages are being lost, but we don't preserve culture. You preserve jam. These are living, dynamic people that are not vestigial. They are here with us who every one of society of which deserves a place at the Council of Human Wisdom, and they all have something to say that the world needs to hear. So, I think this is why your book is so profoundly hopeful and so appropriate for Earth Day. Now, I'm only,
Wait, you mentioned Valeria Clark in Mexico.
yeah,
Another extraordinary story, someone who stumbled on a way to do something. She bought up a bone dry ranch, played out bone dry ranch in southern Arizona, now has similar properties in northern Mexico. Had been overgrazed. Well, that was easy enough to handle because you could just get rid of the cows, but then it was still as dry as dust. It wasn't that it never had water, it had water irregularly. It got violent rainstorms 2 or 3 times a year, but they just sluiced through and were lost. Except for one little spot on one of her properties where the water seemed not to go away, and she didn't know what to do about it. And she had some guys working for her who came from Mexico. She asked them if they could help. Turned out they were from a part of Mexico where it had this extraordinary history of being able to build stone walls, dry stone walls, meaning no mortar, just link stones together, but airtight, watertight, dry stone walls. So they said, sure, and they threw up a few stones together, and the water then began to puddle and green stuff began to grow around it. And she suddenly thought, these guys working on these trincheras, as they call them, these dams, they were the trincheristas. Let's apply this across the gullies where the water sluices through. Well, turned out that was just what the water needed. The trincheras that she built in layers became sort of stepping stones down which this water could gently glide instead of whooshing through. And now great green corridors have grown up around all of the streams on her lands. And fish have come back to the waters. There are bear wandering through the woods.
Gary
and as I
Nabhan.
said, I could only do with what I had. I wanted water, but all I had was stones. Stones brought her water.
I think Gary Nabhan calls it the capital of honeybees, doesn't he?
This is the bee capital of the world. And
yeah,
his friend, a former head of the Ecological Society, says there are very few forces in nature that can change landscapes. There are volcanoes, there is erosion, and there is Valeria Clark.
Well, but let me jump into a couple of questions from our audience, and the first one that jumps to mind, particularly in light of Ms. Clark, is one of the members of the club asked the obvious, which we all ask all the time. What is it that the individual can do, and you've individual can do? But answer that question straight up, Tony.
Well, on the macro scale, you can get involved if you feel like it with big efforts. E.O. Wilson has set up a Half Earth project. Half Earth is actually a phrase I came up with in conversation with him one day, and he's run with it. There's a more Canadian and Western-based group called Nature Needs Half, which has the same goal. The WIS Foundation has set up a campaign for nature. Hans-Jürg Wyss, Swiss multimillionaire, billionaire, has given $1 billion to the bringing biodiversity back. So these are the overarching kind of things, but there are at every level, statewide, countywide, there are land trusts to get involved with, to protect land, to put easements on them. And the other thing that's remarkable about what's happening is that coalitions are coming into being of people who never really had much time for each other. For instance, in the East, people who are interested in hiking, trail types, are teaming up with people interested in land protection. People more interested in protecting the land around the trails. And now there's new evidence that the Appalachian Trail has managed to create a wild corridor that is 1,000 feet wide around the trail. But there's evidence that if you could create a corridor that's 1.25 miles wide, 2 kilometers wide, you could then have room not only for footpaths, but for animal corridors as well. So that's one part of reclaiming what Mackay called the Appalachian Realm, the larger landscape. And there, the big idea that's floating around is that potentially that Appalachian Realm is the central park of the east coast of the United States, of value to the cities along the east coast, as well as to the cities to the west of it, the Midwestern cities, another line of cities. So, and now there are 3 trails, parallel trails coming into being. To the east of the Appalachian Trail is the East Coast Greenway along the cities of the East Coast, even longer than the Appalachian Trail. To the west of the Appalachian Trail is another mountain pathway. So you've got these 3 lines coming north from the southeast. The next challenge is to create spokes across this and create a real ladder network of trails, as well as protecting the landscape.
You know, I think we're always impatient, and history is like this river that flows beneath us. We never know its current, where it's going, but it moves. And I think it's useful on Earth Day to remember how far we've come. You know, I mentioned earlier, Lady Bird Johnson's Beautify America campaign was just to try to get people to stop throwing garbage out a car window. And so we may not be going as fast as we'd like to, but history is flowing beneath us. And this COVID moment, and this raises another wonderful question from Carol Devine, is, you know, COVID has caused us all obviously to pause. There's been enormous suffering, but it has also been a moment for reflection. And the question is, what do we do with this moment? And I actually have an article coming out in the New Explorers Journal asking just this. How do we use COVID as a moment to rethink? So, for example, Tony, I don't know what I bet your schedule is crazy. Before COVID, I was flying off somewhere every week, if not twice a week. And I look back on that travel schedule as if it was a violent hallucination. I'm just not going to do it anymore. I will continue to travel for serious writing projects, for a personal illumination, for my family. But the idea of running off to give that speech to the annual Ball Bearing Manufacturers Association in Cleveland ain't going to happen. And I think it ain't going to happen for a lot of people. And I think that we're going to see, hopefully, a real rethinking about the nature of travel, and that image we all have of O'Hare Airport on a Tuesday afternoon, this sort of beehive of people going everywhere in every direction, for what questionable purpose, who knows? I hope that will not come back. Maybe it will, maybe I'm being delusional, but I think COVID gives us a chance to rethink our life ways. And I think back to the first question, what can you do individually? Of course, you can change your ecological footprint on the planet.
Yes, that's true. I must say I feel certain, sorry on behalf of the ball bearing manufacturers who won't get to hear you, but this is something I tried to write about actually in an earlier book. There's something in us, we're hardwired for it, where we, and this is what we look for when we travel, the opportunity to use all our senses at once, to deeply drink in what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're smelling and tasting and feeling. I called it deep travel. But because it's hardwired into us, it's available anywhere. You don't have to go to a place you've heard of to activate this, because it's always there. And that's why walking around Greenwich Village with Timon McPherson was so extraordinary for me, because I could see not only the tiny plants that are there now, but the opportunity for green walls and green roofs to grow up around us over the next decade or so. So there are always opportunities. You're never not in an ecosystem. There's a brilliant planner I know, environmental planner in Maine, named Ulla Amundsen. He says when people ask him, how do I get involved? What can I do? One thing he says to them is, well, who's the Henry David Thoreau of your area, of your neighborhood? Who's the Andrew Wyeth? Who has thought and felt deeply about this place? And then look around to see who else is working on these very issues. It's the easiest thing in the world to get involved. I was just talking the other night to Greg Treinish from Adventure Scientists, and how he says it takes only 3 seconds to get reconnected back in, and then you feel capable of doing what you've always wanted to be able to do. And I was talking with him and Lauren Oakes, who's writing about creating the forests of the future. And we sort of realized we were the nucleus of an optimist club. We all thought this is all doable. It's not that it isn't an immense job. It is an immense job.
Yeah, there's something, it's something that
circumstances are precarious, but so many people are already working on it.
Yeah.
So many people, that was another thing to find out, have been working on it for 100 years or more, that we have a chance. And yes, North America does have the good luck of being able to say less than 40% of our continent is devoted to human uses at this point. So it isn't as if we're talking about pushing people aside in order to protect land. It's just talking about sharing the planet and finding enough space for all of us. And that we do have world enough, we have time enough and space enough for this beleaguered planet to make it possible.
And I think even for, one final question that came up is, okay, what do we do? How do we address the issues in places that don't have this luxury of space, And I think, and this may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think there we depend on the fundamental goodness of the human heart. That may sound very naive, but I'll share one story. I did a lot of work in Haiti, and I remember standing on a bluff with a voodoo priest, looking out over this kind of leprous, half-hearted landscape, of a very rich island that as recently as the 1920s had been 85% forested. Now the forest cover was down to perhaps 3 or 4%. And I looked out on this valley, and I could only see locust. But my friend, my Haitian friend, could only see angels. I was perhaps more biologically accurate, but he did a lot more to do honor to the human heart and the human spirit. And he was not going to let anyone say that was a degraded landscape. It was his landscape. And I think that doesn't suggest that we cannot improve and help the Haitian people bring back biologically their landscape, but the strength of the possibility lies in the vision of the individual, in that case, a Haitian, who was not prepared to live in a place about which he could have no pride. And I think that may be a kind of a key arrow in the quiver of hope.
Well, we can start from where we are, wherever that happens to be.
Well, Tony, I think we've run out of time. It's been so great to talk to you.
Same.
Remember, everybody, Bill Hasseltine's visit to the club virtual talk next the 26th.
Sign off.
Yeah.
I do want to say thank you to you, Wade, and I also thank you to Ann Passer for putting this evening together. And I do hope that people will want to read Rescuing the Planet, and I am happy to send along book plates in lieu of a personal signing. And Wade, you've been an extraordinary host. Thank you.
Well, I'm gonna do something better here. I want to hold it up so everybody can see it. This really is like a prayer. It's like a prayer for the well-being of all of us. And on Earth Day, it comes to us as a real gift. So I encourage you to get the book, share the book with your family, give it to your cousins, and spread the word. And Tony, thanks so very much. You ought to be a member of this club.
Nothing would be more lovely than something like that.
Okay, well, let's talk about that.
And thank you, Wade, and amen to what you're saying.
Okay, God bless you, Tony. Good luck with the book.